What is a book? Well, it can be many things. It has pages, usually with words printed on them, and often there's pictures as well. And a book is bound between two covers, and it has an author and a title and a date of publication, and so on. So here's a book. It says 1489 on the front cover. We look inside, we see that this very old book is bound with manuscript and leaves, illuminated with red initials. And there's the name of the author of this book, Boethius. And at the bottom we see a handwritten note dated 1491, right down there. So whoever owned the book probably acquired it in that year. Now here we have the beginning of the main text in this volume, which is a poem to begin the Consolation of Philosophy. And the opening lines, beginning with the letter C there in the middle, is Carmina qui quandam studio florente peregi, flebilis heu maestos cogor inire modos. I'm going to say a little bit about that poem later in this video. But first let's just inspect. We have the main text in larger letters set in the center of every page, and surrounding it is in smaller text a commentary. Marginal notes, and if we flip to another leaf, we see even more detailed kinds of marginalia, these lovely pointing hand symbols, drawing attention to some part of the text. So we get a glimpse, opening up a book like this, of the reading habits of someone in late 15th century Venice. Boethius was a Roman philosopher who was put to death in 524 AD by King Theodoric. He wrote the Consolation of Philosophy while he was awaiting execution. It is a marvelous book. It alternates between poetry and prose. In the prose passages, there's an ongoing dialogue between Boethius and philosophy, who is personified as a wise woman of imposing stature. The book had enormous prestige down through the centuries. Dante revered Boethius, and Chaucer translated him. Boethius gave us the idea of a wheel of fortune, which can bring great happiness one minute and sheer woe the next. The edition we just looked at contains a commentary, so in fact it is two texts bound as one. Just imagine the typographical challenge of presenting two texts on every page. And so when we consider this book, it's not just a text, it is also a work of visual art in its design. It is a fairly big book. It's a folio. It's the sort of book that was meant to be read while seated at a desk or standing at a lectern. You wouldn't read it while curled up on a sofa or lying in bed. It is a book to be read and studied slowly and carefully. Now here we have a much smaller book, also Boethius, The Consolation of Philosophy. This is the kind of book you can actually hold in one hand. And if English is your preferred language, then you can read it, because this is an English translation from 1695 by Lord Preston. And we open it up to the beginning of the text. We see book 1 begins with Metrum 1, the first poem, the one that I mentioned, Carmina qui quandam studio Florente peregi, etc. Of course, they don't give all the Latin, but then below it in the italic type we see the English translation. I who before did lofty verse indite, in mournful numbers, now my griefs recite.
We've looked at two very different editions of what, from one point of view, is the same book. The first is from 1489 and is therefore an incunable, which is to say that it belongs to the earliest period, or cradle, of the history of printing using movable type. That period began with Gutenberg's Bible in 1454 and lasted until 1500. The second book I showed you was published 200 years later in 1695. Now, that's a fairly long time from one point of view. To say that both of the books I showed you are old, well, not untrue, is to speak in very broad terms. So let's think again about how these two books differ. One is big, one is small, one is in Latin, and one is in English. One is presumably meant for scholars or monks, and the other is for a wider reading public who read the book for leisure and quite probably did not know enough Latin to read the book in the original language. So when we ask what a book is, we have to consider many other questions besides what's the title and who's the author. So far I've been describing these books as things or objects. But once we begin reading them, we enter a wider field of thought than what the physical features of the book alone point to. Reading means, among other things, reconstructing the cultural context of a book. Nobody could sketch the cultural context of the consolation of philosophy in a few minutes, a few hours, or even a few days. So what I will do now is just say a few things about the opening two lines of the poem that I quoted to you.
And here we have the poem beginning with these two lines at the top. These two lines form an elegiac couplet. The first line is a dactylic hexameter, or 6-foot line, in the meter of epic poetry. And the second line is a dactylic pentameter, a 5-foot line. Boethius may have had in mind Ovid as a model when he wrote his elegiac couplets. Here's a couplet from the beginning of the Amores by Ovid. Boethius composed his poem in elegiac couplets because that's the poetic meter that fits the occasion. He's awaiting execution, so he begins his book with an elegy for himself. One word in Preston's translation caught my ear, and that is numbers. In Preston's day, numbers meant verses, and he used it as an alternative to the word verse, which he'd already used in the first line. If we look at Ovid, we will see the cognate numero. So here, the translator from my Loeb Classical Library edition has translated gravi numero as weighty numbers. Jump ahead to 1819 and we have John Keats, beginning of his Ode to Psyche. O goddess, hear these tuneless numbers, rung by sweet enforcement and remembrance dear. For someone writing in 1819, this is an old-fashioned word, numbers. It's a backward glance to the diction of poets writing a century or more before Keats, including Milton. This old-fashioned diction is essential to the power of Keats' poetry. There's a resonance between Keats and Preston, not unlike the resonance we might hear between a song by Brahms and an aria by Purcell. Though, of course, Preston was a minor poet and Keats was a major one.
When we talk about the cultural context of a book, we mean all the texts that might resonate with it or help us to grasp its meaning. And that includes books written before and after it. We might be interested in other things about a book, such as the society in which the author lived or the author's biography. But reading a work of literature means, above all, taking a dive into the universe of literature. I am daunted by that universe. But when I think about how little of it I know, I am consoled by this fact. So many treasures lie in store for me when I eventually get around to reading all the books that I have not yet discovered.